program that was put together from some very generous donors who wanted to endow a program that would be bringing us formidable thinkers around founding ideas around this nation. And so tonight we have Robert Barnett, who's going to introduce in a second, distinguished professor of law from Georgetown University. Also, as I found out, a former prosecutor, so we have some fun with that as well. But thank you for being here. We look forward to a formidable evening and getting off the series to a great start. I'm going to introduce our wonderful provost, Dr. Lily McNair, who will formally introduce our speakers. So Lily.
Thank you very much, President Barassi. This is indeed an honor to welcome all of you here to our inaugural distinguished lecture of the Founding Fathers series. This is an idea that came to fruition through a series of commitments by donors throughout the country who felt the important need to have a conservative viewpoint on our college campus. So this is an opportunity for all of us to have an important dialogue around issues that relate to us as an American republic and democracy. We are very pleased to have Professor Randy E. Barnett from Georgetown University Law Center. He's the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Legal Theory, where he teaches constitutional law and contracts, and is director of the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. After graduating from Northwestern University and Harvard Law School, he tried many felony cases as a prosecutor in the Cook County State's Attorney Office in Chicago. He's a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in Constitutional Studies and the Bradley Prize. He's also been a visiting professor at Penn, Northwestern, and Harvard Law Schools. His publications include 12 books, more than 100 articles and reviews, as well as numerous op-eds. Well, earlier we talked about his legal career, and he remarked on how fulfilling it is to be a professor, to be a teacher of some of the brightest and the most committed students in law school throughout the nation. And he smiles even when I look at him and I talk to him about that. His works include Restoring the Law's Constitution, The Presumption of Liberty, The Structure of Liberty, Justice and the Rule of Law, and his latest book, Our Republican Constitution, Securing the Liberty and Sovereignty of We the People. I asked Professor Barnett, did you plan on being a professor of the law? And he said, you know, at one time I thought about being a philosophy professor. So the idea of being a professor in law school wasn't that far-fetched. But he talked about the importance of mentoring, to help one reach that goal of becoming a professor. We have copies of this book here tonight, and in this book he asks, how should society be structured so that individuals pursue happiness while living in close proximity to others? He is a political philosopher. In the introduction to this book, George Will says, Professor Barnett has written not an agenda for action, but a call to reflection. We are in for an evening of reflection, of consideration, of important legal theory, as Professor Barnett brings us through a lecture entitled From Bork to Gorsuch, How Originalism Was Mainstreamed. Please join me in welcoming our honored guest, Professor Randy E. Barnett.
Well, thank you, Lily, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Richard, for inviting me to be here today. It's a great honor to be here, to be the inaugural professor in this series of lectures at this wonderful place. Fortunately, the clouds lifted and I was able to see the magnificent view you have of the city lights from here, and it's really quite impressive. Well, anyway, I'm here to talk about what happened between the nomination of Robert Bork and the nomination of Neil Gorsuch to be on the Supreme Court, because this was a very big difference between the two. But I don't assume that those of you who are students here in the room remember any of this. Most all of this happened before you were born. So I'm going to refresh the recollection of those who are old enough to remember it, and then I'm going to bring you up to speed as to what actually happened. And thanks very much for that. Still there, but shaking your head, still buzzing? Okay, we're good. All right, let me start over again. 30 years ago, on June 26, 1987, Justice Lewis Powell resigned his seat on the Supreme Court, and 4 days later, on July 1st, President Ronald Reagan nominated former Yale law professor and D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Robert Bork to take his place. Within 45 minutes of the nomination, Massachusetts Democratic Senator Ted Kennedy took to the Senate floor with a strong condemnation of Bork. I'm going to show you just the briefest of clips from this floor speech. I grabbed it off the internet, didn't realize till after I'd grabbed it what it was actually doing on the internet, so I want to explain. You're going to see a little circle box in the lower right-hand corner around the woman's face that's sitting there next to Senator Kennedy. That is the future Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who was a Kennedy aide at the time. So this clip was actually put together to show that Sonia Sotomayor was on the Senate floor while Ted Kennedy was giving this famous speech. So that's where this town hall clip came from. But here's just gives you a taste of the most famous line from this quite famous speech. Again, Kennedy speaking within 45 minutes of the nomination being announced by the president.
Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, rogue police could break down citizens' doors in midnight raids, and school children could not be taught about evolution. Writers and artists would be censured at the whim of government.
He then went on to finish that sentence, and the doors of the federal courts would be shut on the fingers of millions of citizens. So that was the initial attack made 45 minutes after the nomination. It was not until mid-September, some 4 months later, that the Senate Judiciary Committee convened 12 days of hearings, which were spread over more than 2 weeks. While the hearings were in session, People for the American Way, a group funded and founded by progressive Hollywood TV producer Norman Lear, aired paid TV commercials narrated by Gregory Peck, who was at that time a very big Hollywood movie star, which attacked Bork as an extremist. And this ad actually comes from the People from the American Way website. They are very proud of this ad, kind of put them on the map. So here is how it went.
There's a special feeling of awe people get when they visit the Supreme Court of the United States, the ultimate guardian of our rights as Americans. That's why we set the highest standards for our highest court justices, and that's why we're so concerned. This is Gregory Peck. Robert Bork wants to be a Supreme Court justice, but the record shows that he has a strange idea of what justice is. He defended poll taxes and literacy tests, which kept many Americans from voting. He opposed a civil rights law that ended whites-only signs at lunch counters. He doesn't believe the Constitution protects your right to privacy. And he thinks that freedom of speech does not apply to literature and art and music. Robert Bork could have the last word on your rights as citizens, but the Senate has the last word on him. Please urge your senators to vote against the Bork nomination, because if Robert Bork wins a seat on the Supreme Court, it will be for life, his life and yours.
Oops, okay. Well, we want to look at this beautiful picture of Wagner College now? We can turn that off if you are able to. Okay. That gives you some flavor of what oh, there we go, logging off. That gives you some flavor of what the public debate was about. I'll say a little more about that in a moment. Now, much of the Democrats' focus during these hearings that were held was on Bork's commitment to originalism, what's called originalism, and I will define originalism for you in a moment. In particular, they focused on the outcomes they said would result from employing a consistent originalist methodology. And it was on the basis of these alleged results that many both inside and outside the Senate would claim that Bork would turn back the clock on civil rights. On October 23rd, 1987, some 4 months after he was nominated, Robert Bork's nomination was rejected by the Democrat-led Senate by a vote of 58 to 42. While 2 Democrats voted for his confirmation, 6 Republicans joined the Democrats to vote against him. With Bork's rejection, Justice Powell's seat would eventually be filled by Justice Anthony Kennedy. And the verb to be borked had entered into the political lexicon. If you want a particular moment in time when the politicization of the judicial nomination process began, this was it. Never before had a judicial nomination confronted an organized publicity campaign outside the courtroom, complete with television ads. Now, some 30 years later, on January 31st, 2017, President Donald Trump nominated Judge Neil Gorsuch to assume the seat vacated by the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. Hearings on this nomination, held 2 months later, in March, occupied just 4 days, not 2 weeks, 4 days. On April 7th, a little over 2 months since his nomination, Justice Gorsuch was confirmed by a vote of 54 to 45, with 2 Democrats joining all 52 Republicans. This was truly remarkable. In the wake of the failed Bork nominations, each of the persons Republican presidents nominated to be justices, Anthony Kennedy, David Souter, John Roberts, and Sam Alito, had abstained from identifying themselves as originalists. It was thought that was one of the things that sunk Bork, so you don't want to say you're an originalist, because that's what they did to Bork, they'll do to you. Even that originalist stalwart, Clarence Thomas, did not self-identify as an originalist at the time of his nomination. That came later when he was on the bench. Unlike all these men, Neil Gorsuch had expressly endorsed originalism as the proper method of constitutional interpretation. Indeed, he had been chosen in part because he had publicly endorsed originalism. So, as they had with Bork, Senate Democrats once again sought to make an issue of this commitment. And because Judge Gorsuch stuck to his guns in defense of his originalism during his hearings, the issue was joined. Yet this time, not only was the result different, so too was the popular discourse. Although some of you aren't old enough to remember the Bork nomination hearings, all of you are old enough to have followed, at least in the press, what had happened during the Gorsuch nominations. And so you are all in this room personal witnesses to the fact that despite the sometimes harsh questioning by Senate Democrats, there was no public outcry about Gorsuch's originalism. We heard no litany of the civil rights that would be rolled back were he to be confirmed. The only thing you may remember hearing about, but I'm sure you've forgotten about by now, is the case of a single frozen truck driver. Well, what happened over the past 30 years that accounts for this difference in both the tenor and the outcome of the debate? And I'm actually as concerned with the difference in the tenor as I am with the outcome. In this talk, I want to provide my answer to this question. But before I do, I want to acknowledge one difference that was crucial, though it's not going to be the one I dwell on. In 1987, the Senate was controlled by the Democrats. In 2017, it was controlled by the Republicans. This meant that Bork needed Democrat support to be confirmed, but Gorsuch did not. That's a pretty big difference. That Gorsuch would be more likely to be confirmed by a Republican Senate majority surely diminished the incentives of activist groups to organize against him. And the fact that supporters of the nominee controlled the Senate Judiciary Committee surely affected its tenor. It also made for a much speedier hearing and final vote by the Senate. On the other hand, to confirm Justice Gorsuch with a majority of 52 votes, Senate Republicans had to use what's called the nuclear option to end the filibuster of all Supreme Court nominees. Let me just briefly tell you what the nuclear option consists of, why it's considered a big deal. Because what happens is, instead of changing the Senate rules according to the rules of the Senate, which requires a supermajority vote to change Senate rules, and that is supposed to be done at the beginning of the Senate session, not during the middle of the session. The nuclear option is a way of changing the Senate rules by an appeal to the chair, and then a ruling from the chair that a particular rule is or is not the rule of the Senate, and that can be voted. Then there's an appeal of that, and that can be approved or disapproved by a majority vote. It's a way that a simple majority can effectively change the rules by a ruling of the chair in the middle of the session and getting around Senate rules. That's what's called the nuclear option. It was the way that Harry Reid, when he was the leader of the Senate, changed the rules and eliminated the filibuster for lower court nominees and for executive branch officials, but not for the Supreme Court. So in order to confirm Justice Gorsuch without a supermajority in the face of a filibuster, the Republicans would have to use the nuclear option that Harry Reid had used in order to eliminate the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees the way Harry Reid had done so for lower court judges and for executive branch officials. And I can tell you personally, from personal knowledge, that changing the rules to eliminate the filibuster, and especially changing it by means of the nuclear option, was not popular amongst many Republican senators who basically, A, did not like the rules changed in that way, which they considered to be somewhat underhanded when it was done to them, and B, they liked the legislative filibuster, and they thought eliminating the filibuster for judges would make the legislative filibuster harder to maintain in the future. For that reason, it was not popular amongst Republican senators to do so. And it's because of that, I believe, that if the Democrats had been able to demonize Judge Gorsuch the way they had effectively demonized Judge Bork, there would not have been 52 senators to vote to change the rules using the nuclear option. In other words, the filibuster would not have been abolished. And if it had not been abolished, the vote would have been 52 to 48. And with that vote of 50 or 54 to 48, whatever it would be, it would not be enough to break a filibuster. And what we have is a typical Washington kabuki of a motion for cloture, to close debate, that the majority of the Senate voted for, but not enough to close debate, and then debate would not be ended, would not be closed, and as a result of that, the 52 votes would not be enough to confirm, would not be enough to get to the vote, and therefore it would fail, and they'd move on to the next nominee. But that didn't happen, and that didn't happen, I submit, because they did not successfully demonize Gorsuch, and Republicans did hold together, and they were willing to change the rules of the Senate, and they were willing to abolish the filibuster. And that's why the failure to demonize Gorsuch turns out to be an extremely big deal, even though the Republicans did control the Senate. Moreover, recall that 30 years ago, 6 Republican senators voted against Robert Bork's nomination, whereas none voted against Neil Gorsuch. In part, this was due to the fact that some of the criticisms aimed at Bork got traction, especially those surrounding his being an originalist, while the critics who questioned Judge Gorsuch about his originalism repeatedly spun their wheels. How come? Why? Why did they repeatedly spin their wheels? I believe at least part of this difference is the result of what I call for this lecture the mainstreaming of originalism. The mainstreaming of originalism. So it's worth considering how and why this mainstreaming happened. For the explanation reveals the limits of what senators and activists can do on the ground without the air cover provided by academics, and in this case, by law professors. In the 30 years between Bork and Gorsuch, while Republican presidents nominated non-originalist Republican justices like Kennedy, Souter, Roberts, and Alito, a small handful of legal academics, and I mean a very small handful, were developing the theory of originalism. And with the elevation of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, their efforts have now borne fruit. So let me first begin by explaining, I promised you I would, explaining what is originalism, okay? Originalism is the view that first, the meaning of the written Constitution was fixed at the time it was enacted, and second, that this fixed meaning should constrain constitutional actors, including judges and legislators today. Let me say that again, because this is it. Originalism is the view that first, the meaning of the written Constitution, the meaning of the text, was fixed at the time it was enacted, and secondly, that fixed meaning should constrain constitutional actors today. I know that sounds like a terribly radical doctrine, or actually, I'm being sarcastic here. It doesn't sound terribly radical, but it's considered to be terribly radical by some people. But that's what originalism is defined as. Now, to appreciate why it's so, why should constitutional actors today be constrained by the meaning that was fixed at the time the Constitution was enacted, it's good to start with the proposition that the Constitution is not the law that governs us. Here's a copy of the Constitution. The Constitution is not the law that governs us. This is the law that governs those who govern us. This is the law that governs those who govern us. They then make laws that govern us. But this is the law that governs them on behalf of us. And those who are to be governed by this Constitution can no more change the law that governs them without going through the amendment process described in Article 5 of this Constitution than we, the people, can change the speed limits that govern us without going through the legislative process by which speed limits are set. Just as we, the people, cannot update the speed limits to ones we think are more suitable, and we know speed limits are oftentimes set unreasonably low to raise revenue for local government. Even so, we cannot simply on our own update the speed limits to ones we deem more reasonable, or adopt what, shall we say, living speed limits that we're willing to adjust based on what we think is appropriate at a given moment, without going through the legislative process. No more can we do that than can those who are to be governed by this law change the law that governs them without going through the Article 5 amendment process. So basically, what this suggests is that originalism can be boiled down. I gave you two things that originalism has. I can boil now originalism down to one sentence. And the one sentence that represents originalism is this: the meaning of the Constitution should remain the same until it's properly changed by amendment. The meaning of the Constitution should remain the same until it's properly changed by amendment. That's originalism. That's what it is. Now, so the first point I want to make, after having given you this little explanation of originalism, is that in 1987, none of what I just said was articulated or widely known. Because in 1987, there was little or no theory of originalism. Now, there were people who were doing originalism. There were judges who were deciding cases on the basis of what the meaning of this text was when it was enacted, or arguing you should do that. People were saying that, but there was no theory of that practice until really 1980 is when it started, 1980. Because it was in 1980 that the term originalism itself was coined. The term didn't exist in legal discourse prior to 1980. It was coined in a particular law review article, written by a particular guy. And his name was Paul Barnett. He was a professor, he still is a professor, at Stanford Law School, a progressive professor at Stanford Law School, and he wrote an article that was published in the Boston University Law Review, in which he coined the term originalism. An article in which he criticized the writings of conservative writers such as Robert Bork and Raoul Berger. Raoul Berger was his principal target. He wrote a book called Government by Judiciary that talked about how the 14th Amendment had been misinterpreted. That book came out in 1977. He was a Harvard researcher, and that book came out. And this paper that Bress wrote came out 3 years after that book, basically trying to explain why Berger and Bork were wrong. But in order to do that, Bress not only had to coin the term originalism, he had to reconstruct a theory of originalism and then criticize it. Because there was no theory of originalism. There were just these guys making certain kinds of arguments. And Bress actually did a very admirable job in reconstructing a theory of the position he was going to criticize. I recommend that to you. But I think because neither Bork nor Berger or other people like that at the time actually had a theory of originalism, it's actually, and the term originalism hadn't even been invented yet, I think it's better to call these folks proto-originalists or pre-originalists. And their proto-originalism was very different than the originalism of today. The originalism that Brest reconstructed, somewhat accurately, is different than the originalism that we have today. And now I want to explain to you what the difference is. First and foremost, proto-originalists uniformly invoke the intentions of the Constitution's drafters or framers to decide what was constitutional today. So you hear a lot of talk about the framers, the intentions of the framers. It's a natural way of speaking. So if, for example, the framers of the First Amendment did not intend, expect, or foresee its free speech protections applying to, for example, flag burning in 1791, when the First Amendment was enacted, then the First Amendment today should not be construed as applying to flag burning. Or, if the framers of the 14th Amendment did not intend, expect, or foresee it applying to segregated schools or discrimination against women in 1868, when the amendment was ratified, then the 14th Amendment today should not be so construed. That was how proto-originalism argued. At his hearing, the central issue of Bork's originalism was framed by former Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Shirley Hofstetler like this, quoting her testimony now. To limit the search for meaning to the thoughts of colonial gentlemen as applied to the conditions of the 17th and 18th centuries would destroy the hopes of its draftsmen to write a charter of government for their posterity, and, I might add, for our own. It is as futile to discern the meaning of these words from a crabbed originalist point of view as it would be to know the meaning of marriage solely by the words of the nuptial vows and the thoughts of the bride and groom on their wedding day. Or, as Senator Kennedy put it in a question to University of Chicago law professor Philip Curlin, quote, this is his question, given what he has said as an originalist thinker, and given his statements here about the limitations of the Constitution in enhancing or even defining the kinds of rights and liberties that are being protected, would this be an area that would be of very considerable concern to you, should he be approved, that there may be a significant threat to the rights and liberties of the American people? Curlin responded yes to that question. It would be a concern to him. But in response to powerful criticisms leveled against originalisms by law professors like Paul Brest and others, over the past 30 years, originalism has markedly changed from the proto-originalism of original framers' intentions and expectations to something else. Starting back in the 1980s, then Court of Appeals Judge Antonin Scalia urged lawyers in the Reagan Justice Department, working under Attorney General Edwin Meese, to stop talking about the intentions of the framers and to start talking instead about the meaning the words of the text would have had to the general public. In other words, to stop seeking the framers' intent and start seeking the original public meaning of the text. But this was a call largely heard within the walls of the Office of Legal Counsel in the Meese Justice Department. In the 1990s, after the failure of the Bork nomination, this call moved into the academic realm, most notably in the writings of Northwestern University law professor Gary Lawson, who is now on the law faculty of Boston University. The move from framers' intent to original public meaning was big. It was big. It meant that we today are bound not by the prejudices of those who wrote and enacted the Constitution and its amendments, but by the public meaning of the words they wrote and ratified. Now, the second big move was made in the 1990s, not by a law professor, but by a young political science professor at Princeton University named Keith Whittington. It was Whittington who first noticed that when we focus only on the words of the Constitution, we find that the information conveyed by those words may simply not be enough to resolve a constitutional controversy. I mean, this booklet, which is the Constitution, contains information. The information contained in this book was fixed at the time it was written, but it may not have enough information in it to decide every case that comes before us that we have to decide upon. When that happens, we unavoidably move from constitutional interpretation, which is figuring out what the words mean, to the activity of constitutional, what might be called constitutional construction, And it was Whittington who reintroduced the distinction between interpretation and construction that had previously been a fixture of legal theory dating back at least to the 1830s, but which had somewhat been lost by law professors. What is the difference? By interpretation, we are talking about the activity of identifying the communicative content of the text. That is, what is the information conveyed by this booklet? By construction, we mean the different activity of putting that information into effect, applying it to particular cases and controversies. That's a separate activity than ascertaining its meaning. We can call it anything you want to call it, but Whittington chose to adopt the traditional terminology of calling one interpretation and one construction. While the application of some constitutional provisions are straightforward, the president must be 35 years of age. Congress consists of a House and a Senate, and each state gets 2 senators. The provisions we argue most about were written in a more general way and are not always so obvious to apply. What exactly is speech protected by the First Amendment? And as important, what constitutes an abridgment of the right of freedom of speech? What exactly is a search that is governed by the Fourth Amendment? And as important, what constitutes an unreasonable search and seizure? While the possible answers to these questions may be narrowed down by a historical examination of the original public meaning of these terms, it may still, that meaning, that original meaning, may still leave open a range of options for present-day constitutional actors, be they legislators in Congress, the president, or federal judges. These 2 theoretical developments, the move from framers' intent to original public meaning, and the recognition of the difference between identifying original meaning and applying it to cases, left a lot of room for originalist results, genuinely originalist results, that better comport with contemporary sensibilities. In 1999, I delivered a lecture at Loyola Law School in New Orleans entitled An Originalism for Non-Originalists, in which I contended that there was much in originalism that progressives could and should embrace. Indeed, when Robert Bork was nominated in 1987, I myself was not an originalist, primarily because I did not see why we should be bound by the intentions of the framers. I dismissed this at the time in an article as looking at the framers as our wardens, I said, requiring what I call channeling the framers, which approach constitutional controversies by asking questions such as, "Oh, framers, would you think the thermal imaging of a home to detect the increased heat caused by marijuana cultivation is a search?" Sometimes this is shorthand called, "What would Madison do?" Asking what would Madison do to decide a current case of controversy. This is not, by the way, a historical inquiry because there was no thermal imaging at the time. This is a hypothetical reconstruction of what somebody who thought the way they thought might decide at the time, but it's not a historical matter that can be discovered by historical research, the way the meaning of the words can be discovered by historical research. And I also accepted as valid critiques leveled at proto-originalists by Paul Brest and others, that seeking some kind of collective intention of the framers that was definite enough to resolve present cases and controversies like whether thermal imaging constitutes a search or not was simply impractical. When I became a law professor in 1982, it's a long time ago, I taught contracts, not constitutional law. By 1999, I had come to see that seeking the original public meaning of the text was very much like seeking the objective meaning of a written contract. And in fact, when you teach contract law, when you study contract law, you know the meaning of a contract is its objective meaning, not the subjective meaning attached to it by the parties, but what a reasonable person would think the meaning was. And what matters is its meaning at the time of formation, which is an originalist theory of contract interpretation. That's how contract law is done. And I also could see that Whittington's distinction between interpretation and construction was also a feature of classical contract law. And both of these things taken together reveal that originalism had allowed it considerable flexibility in applying the original meaning of the text to contemporary cases and controversies. So by 1999, I had become an originalist. And since then, I've added my voice to the small but growing chorus of originalist law professors who developed what's come to be called the new originalism, based on the original public meaning of the text, but it really ought to just be called originalism. Public meaning originalism as compared to the pre-theoretical originalism of Bork and Berger. And in this, I was soon joined by my Georgetown law colleague, Larry Solem, who's on the faculty with me, who added a very in-depth understanding and comprehension of the philosophy of language and how communication is actually done. And it was this approach, the original public meaning approach, that had been endorsed by then Judge and now Justice Neil Gorsuch, not the framers' intentions approach of proto-originalists like Robert Bork. He specifically said original public meaning in his writings, knowing the difference. So perhaps the biggest difference between 1987 and 2017 was that originalism itself had changed from a theory that was vulnerable to both caricature and accurate criticisms to a position that was both more modest in its claims and easier to defend. In fact, the modesty made it easier. Second, due to the research efforts of law professors, our understanding of the original meaning of the text has greatly developed over the last 30 years. Consider one example featured prominently in the Bork hearings. At his hearing, Bork was asked by Senators Biden and DeConcini about the meaning of the Ninth Amendment. Now, the Ninth Amendment says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Let me say that again. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights that are retained by the people. So he was asked about this, and here's how Bork famously replied. And he made this was not a reply that received a favorable audience, even amongst conservatives. And here's what he said. I do not think you can use the Ninth Amendment unless you know something of what it means. For example, if you had an amendment that says Congress shall make no, and then there is an ink blot, and you cannot read the rest of it, and that is the only copy you have, I do not think the court can make up what might be under the ink blot. Sometimes this is referred to as the ink blot theory of the Ninth Amendment. We just don't know what it means, therefore we can't use it. Well, its meaning is quite inconvenient to Judge Bork, and he just doesn't know what it means. This particular answer was so unpopular that even the Wall Street Journal editorial page at the time criticized him for the statement during the hearings, while the hearings were still happening. Stanford law professor and historian, I should not say progressive or left-wing historian, Tom Gray replied to this particular testimony in the following way. Robert Bork's interpretive philosophy illustrates one of the founders' fears, an interpreter who would, in defiance of the Ninth Amendment, anachronistically betray the central premise of our constitutionalism, the protection on fair terms of all our rights. We need as a people to recapture our constitutional heritage of rights under the rule of law, and I submit to demand of ourselves and certainly of our judges, understanding of and respect for this great and beloved tradition. So you notice what progressive law professor Tom Gray did. He got to Bork's right when he came to enforcing the text of the Constitution. So one of the problems with Bork was that his own deficiencies as an originalist scholar made his commitment to originalism far less easy to defend. Since 1987, however, much excellent research has been done on the original meaning of many provisions of the Constitution, including the original meaning of the Ninth Amendment. Indeed, it was the sustained study of the original meaning of the Ninth Amendment that became the focus of my own scholarship in the 1980s and led me from contracts to constitutional law and to being an originalist. I actually did all this work on the original meaning of the Ninth Amendment when I wasn't an originalist, and I did a whole bunch of work on the original meaning of the Second Amendment, and I wasn't an originalist, and I finally started thinking, why do I even care about all this stuff if originalism has nothing to go on? There's nothing going for it. And that's where I started the process of gradually coming up with a better idea about what originalism is and should be. Now, in my view, the available evidence shows that the original meaning of the rights retained by the people that the Ninth Amendment refers to was a reference to natural liberty rights. Now, I should stress that saying that doesn't imply that judges may invalidate legislation as unconstitutional because it violates the judge's conception of natural rights. But it does mean that the enumeration in the Constitution of such rights as the freedom of speech, press, or assembly does not make these rights privileged over other liberties that are protected by the text of the Constitution and its amendments in their way. So 30 years after the nomination and rejection of Robert Bork to be Justice of the Supreme Court, much has changed. Much has changed. First and foremost, the theory and practice of originalism has been greatly developed and refined, and it is far more defensible than it once was. And secondly, much research on the original meanings of particular provisions like the Ninth Amendment has been conducted, and as a result, the intellectual terrain has shifted greatly from 1987 to 2017. This difference was manifested in Justice Gorsuch's response to a question put to him by Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska on the meaning of the Ninth Amendment. So Sasse asked him about the Ninth Amendment, the way that Biden and Dean Cheney had asked for, can I take a glass of water? Or that little bottle of water, it would be fantastic. Thank you. Thanks very much. That's great. All right, so Senator Ben Sasse asked Gorsuch about the Ninth Amendment. And he actually, and so in stark contrast with Robert Bork's reference to it being an impenetrable ink blot, Justice Gorsuch replied, quote, "Well, Senator, I think it means what it says," unquote. Which, perhaps coincidentally, is the title of my 2006 Texas Law Review article on the original meaning of the Ninth Amendment. It's the Ninth Amendment, it means what it says. That's the title of my piece. It may just be a coincidence, because the idea that it means what it says may be so obvious that you don't need an article to tell you that, but maybe he read my article when he was doing prep for his testimony. It would not be a bad idea to have done that. Then, when asked by Senator Sasse about Robert Bork's reference to it as an ink blot, so Sasse remembered Bork's testimony, and he asked Gorsuch about the ink blot, quote, and Sasse says, seemingly implying that it can just be ignored, Justice Gorsuch merely referenced the fact that the courts had not much interpreted it up until now, and let it go at that. In other words, he kind of punted, actually. No senator pursued the matter further, ending the discussion with a whimper rather than with a bang, unlike before. But perhaps the difference between 1987 and 2017 is most dramatically revealed by who testified at the hearings for Bork and Gorsuch. At the Bork hearings, the list of prominent law professors testifying against his nomination was a veritable who's who of big-time law professors, including Harvard law professor Larry Tribe, Duke law professor Walter Dellinger, Bork's Yale Law School colleagues Owen Fisk and Paul Gewirtz, two of his Yale Law School colleagues testified against him, David A.J. Richards of the NYU School of Law, Stanford law professor Tom Gray, then USC law professor Judith Resnick, who is now on the faculty of Yale Law School, University of Chicago law professor Philip Kurland, then Harvard law professor Kathleen Sullivan, who went on to be the dean of the Stanford Law School, then dean of the Northwestern Law School, Bob Bennett. And I just named the people that legal audiences would recognize these folks' names. In contrast with the who's who of law professors testifying against the nomination of Robert Bork, just a single relatively obscure law professor testified against Judge Gorsuch's nomination. And I won't say his name because he's a perfectly nice guy, and why call him out for being obscure. But you wouldn't recognize his name if I told it to you. Of course, you didn't probably recognize the other guys' names either, but if you were in the business, you would know that. And my colleague Larry Sullivan testified on behalf of Originalism to the committee. With one exception, no prominent law professor criticized Gorsuch for his originalism in the media or in the blogosphere. The exception was Erwin Chemerinsky, who is now dean of the Bothall School of Law at Berkeley, who wrote an op-ed in which he offered an internally contradictory critique of originalism, that it was both it was impossible to identify a singular original meaning of the text, and at the same time, all originalist results are objectionable and horrible. This is a contradiction. You can't both not know what it means, because there's multiple meanings, and every possible meaning is bad. But he said this in succeeding sentences in his op-ed. The only others to criticize Gorsuch publicly for his originalism were marginal or retired law professors who trotted out the same playbook that had been used against the proto-originalism of Robert Bork. Rather than the originalism of today, their criticisms were easily parried. It's an undeniable fact that the most knowledgeable progressive law professors remained on the sidelines during the Gorsuch nomination process. I can only speculate why they did not join the fray this time when they were standing in line to testify against Robert Bork. Perhaps they believed Judge Gorsuch's nomination, his confirmation, was assured, and therefore they did not want to get on the wrong side of a sitting justice. And don't underestimate that as a motivation for a big-time con law professor not wanting to testify against somebody who is going to be on the Supreme Court. It could really happen. But I think another reason for their reticence was because originalism as an approach to constitutional interpretation has been mainstreamed over the past 30 years due to the efforts of the small handful of legal academics who comprise the existing infrastructure of originalist theory and practice. Prominent law professors who have been keeping up with events since Robert Bork's nomination know that originalism itself has changed to a much more defensible position, and for this reason they did not feel comfortable taking it on in public. They knew enough to know that was going to be a much harder lift. If I'm right about that, then who gets to be on law school faculties matters a great deal to the direction of the courts. It's not enough for those who favor adhering to the original meaning of the Constitution to elect a Republican president and a Republican Senate. The intellectual infrastructure of originalist theory and practice must exist outside the courts and outside the political arena. Now, to claim that originalism has been mainstreamed is not to claim that all law professors are originalists. To the contrary, the overwhelming majority of those who teach constitutional law are not originalists and even disparage it to their students in class, although the version of originalism they typically disparage is the proto-originalism of Bork, not the new originalism. But it is to claim that the new and improved originalism can no longer be safely dismissed by those with the gravitas to weigh in on judicial nominations as outside the mainstream of legal academic thought, which is how Bork was described, as outside the mainstream. You can't really say that anymore. As Justice Elena Kagan, the former dean of the Harvard Law School, expressed during her confirmation hearings, at least with respect to the more concrete provisions of the Constitution, quoting her, quoting Elena, "We are all originalists now," unquote. That's a big change. And this mainstreaming of originalism is, to paraphrase Joe Biden's comment on the enactment of Obamacare, a BFD, a big friggin' deal. Thank you.